morning. I'm Tincuta Heinzel. I'm senior lecturer at Loughborough University in UK. I'm teaching textile design. I suppose for those who are social scientists, it's a bit an area quite constructivist, I would say, with some perspective. So a little bit about my background to explain what I'm doing and how I'm doing things. And some insights into my curatorial and research projects. So briefly, I have a bachelor in textiles design, a master in cultural anthropology, so some connection can still be established, and a PhD in aesthetics and art sciences from Paris One universities in France. And if it's about to speak my artistic practice, here are some samples of my work. I was interested in about how to experiment with textiles and fibers. It was all kind of ideas about how to bring this more in a sculptural forms. So we are sometimes accustomed to have fabrics which are quite soft or have them on the walls as tapestries, for example. But this is it's a kind of experimental constructivist way of dealing with textiles. So it was really a kind of mixing textiles and architecture, I would say sculpture and architecture. My diploma work at the time, I also wanted to get into some more dynamic structures at some point, but it's not enough time. I could also present a short film. So I was trying to make a flying carpet because it's such a nice object. So this is one of the main textiles objects you might have. It's a carpet. So the idea is how to make it really trying to make it fly or to give this sensation of performativity into carpets. And I also worked a little bit at that time on this kind of patterns and symbolistic of the carpets, which comes actually from the Middle East and all the tradition coming with that. But bringing a little more technology, because I also use some electronic parts to really make that happen, or at least give that sensation of happening and using that as a performance. I wouldn't say that I was particularly innovative in that sense, but I was certainly influenced by all this kind of tradition of fiber art movement in Eastern Europe. I briefly wanted to speak about, to show you here the work of Magdalena Bakanovic and Anna Lupac, who was coming actually from my hometown, and she used also to teach to my university in Cluj. And it was about this kind of trying to bring this kind of more modernist experiments into the field of art, into a context in which the political, I would say, was trying to impose social realism as a norm for the visual arts. So the only escape to try to do some more modernist experiment and visual experiment was actually through or in fields of applied arts. And otherwise, the idea actually, at least in the communist time, was that I have to become a designer in a factory. Romania at the time was one of the most important, still is, textiles, has one of the most important textiles industries in Europe. But by the time I was graduating, everything was turned upside down, at least politically and economically. Textiles factory closed. I think this is quite common somehow. It's a kind of this kind of disindustrialization. It's not specific only for Romania, but I think in this kind of post-socialist transition, it's very specific for Eastern Europe at least. And this brings a lot of question, but we still had quite a lot of fun. There were some pictures of my colleagues making experience in the streets and trying to have fun a little bit. So therefore, at some point, there was there was a master in cultural anthropology in Cluj, and it was quite promising as a context. And that's the moment I decided to switch a little bit and try to learn something new. And I did a master degree in visual anthropology, focusing on visual representation issues. What is it? How do you represent something? Which means my master thesis was actually in Romanian documentary films in the 50s and 60s, speaking about propaganda and how the image is used, reinterpreted, how technically is actually this works, kind of infrastructure you need for that. But I also little by little switched towards the digital culture and tactical media, and what does it really means to work with the media, and this kind of relationship actually between invention and innovation. And I ended up by connecting actually the two parts, the textiles and the media, to write a PhD in Paris related to electronic and creative textiles. And it had to do with everything was actually starting to, at the time, and was kind of the beginning of everything has to do with this kind of physical or digital materialities. The idea of, and all this kind of impact of the revolution of the material sciences, the new way of defining materials, and physical computing, trying to bring all this kind of computation in a much more physical form. So it's actually mixing these aspects of the textiles and the digitality and the media, and analyzing this a little bit more, but having to do also with this kind of what's the impact on the way, for example, we producing things. What's the impact on the industry, how we imagine this kind of production, actually. And I would say briefly, I mean, the three main probably questions of my PhD were, because most of the time we are speaking in terms of very revolutionary, so the textile revolutionized something, or they are revolutionary in some way, and my question was, what exactly make them revolutionary? What exactly do they revolutionize, and what exactly we expect to be revolutionized? Because this is three different questions actually, which not always are on the same, are different layers, and not all the time are coming together. And somehow I take the example of textiles as a paradigmatic case for everything has to do with this kind of change in material science revolution of the way we think about matter at molecular level. And somehow my current project actually is related to this. It's a continuation of that research. And it's related to bringing into question the idea if materials now are defined actually in terms of the function, and the function cannot be detached from a system. What exactly do they have to perform for whom do they have to perform, what they have to do? So that would be somehow some of my questions of which system are the new materials parts of, and how to define this kind of nanotextiles. It's a lot of research about the conductive threads, for example. I'm working with electronic textiles, and for that you need to develop conductive threads with certain properties. What does it really, how does it really work, and what exactly I'm interested in? If I want a specific functionality, for example, for one of my products, how exactly I managed to discuss with my scientist colleagues, a chemist or a physicist or electronist, because sometimes it's the case. And how this could be actually translated in the macro objects, because sometimes what's happening in the micromolecular context has another impact actually in macro macro scale. So it's very difficult to deal with these aspects in between scales. And it also has to do a lot with the representation, because at the molecular level you actually work with this kind of machines which allow you to see those molecules. So it's again how to use this kind of idea of representation, work with this relationship between representation and objects, more or less. And it has to do also with the idea molecules are machines. So what's happening when a material is becoming a tool? We change a little bit the paradigm or the crafts paradigm of tools acting on the materials to create something. So this requires a bit a new way of approaching, or even how the way we teach, for example, I would say in art and design schools. It's a kind of reconsidering our paradigms about how we teach arts and what exactly art and design has to do in this context. So for me, what it's interesting when I'm working with I would say the hard scientist, it's that I'm all the time requested to imagine the context of use. So I have a product, can we imagine a use for that? And this is, for me, sometimes quite interesting. And this would be actually something I would like to do here, to investigate a little bit this kind of imaginary of use the scientists might have for their products. because for me it's quite exciting the kind of patterns some of the scientists are actually developing to explain or make valuable their work, and they have all the time, because it's about research and it's investment, a lot of money, you also have to prove a little bit that what you're doing is relevant. So the designers are all the time requested to come as a second, I would say, actor in this chain, to prove that that's a context of use and there's relevance for that. And sometimes this is not very clear, precisely because it's this difference of scale, but it's also coming back to this kind of three questions. They are not quite the same things, and sometimes we confuse the revolution and we apply it quite differently. So from my perspective, this requires a bit more analysis and research. So this is to speak about this kind of imaginary of nanotechnologies and textiles, and to explain a little bit my context. This is what I've also used to do in terms of practice. I, for example, work in projects which were trying to integrate electronics into textiles structure to make this kind of smart environments. For example, I created the chair, and in the moment when we are sitting on the chair, the lights might get on because it's a connection with the system, and it's a switch, and you have to program and think about how you weave the structure in such a way that it makes a sensor, but in the same time you have to connect it to a larger environment, and you have to write protocols of communication with the other objects and so on. So this is a quite complex, I would say, endeavor, from knowing material aspects, writing the code, know the craft of weaving, because you still need to weave that element. So that's require quite a lot of technical expertise as well. And all the time I feel myself actually quite I would say autodidact somehow. These are some other works I've done about how to create this kind of actuation into textiles, and how, because the digital technology precisely allows us to create this kind of actuation, what kind of actuation you might create, and which scale. I'm still interested in working this kind of media aspects, and it's a work I've done with one of my colleagues, Lassa Sherfik. It's a project, and we worked, it started like an adventure with one of my colleagues. She's historian at CEU, at also Archives and Radio Free Europe Archives, speaking about Budapest. And in 2013, that was the Venice Biennale, has a topic related to encyclopedia, and she was proposing the idea of using the archives of Radio Free Europe as a kind of encyclopedic image of the Eastern Europe, because a lot of scientists actually are relying on those archives as this kind of rich resources about Eastern Europe. And she was actually questioning the way in which this archive has been putting together. And we were trying to work on this kind of critical aspects of the archive, trying to bring this kind of social sciences questions into a much more sensitive form through mediatic or artistic means. And this is, for example, an installation in which we reenact the Radio Free Europe way of broadcasting. We actually use two radio transmitters which are using the same wave, and it was quite common actually to make a kind of interference and to stop the transmission of Radio Free Europe. The Romanians or the Eastern European authorities were doing this quite frequently. So in the end, you never had a complete reception of the broadcasting from Radio Free Europe, because there was all the time a technical interference. And we were trying to reproduce this in an exhibition. It was quite interesting because you can walk with this kind of radios in your hands and catch different transmission. On one side, we tried to put this kind of very socialist communist song. On the other side was some psychedelic rock music, which was forbidden in Romania at the time, just to speak also in this kind of term, cultural representations and how these were used. And it was quite interesting because sometimes even the way you move in the room, the energy of your body could change the wave, and you will find yourself in one or the other side politically, I would say, physically. It was interesting both in terms of physical, technical, and cultural experiment. It was working quite well. So this installation was part of this project I mentioned, to use the repertories of discreteness. There were some other artists who were involved into it. Was Irina Bota John Dean, Istvan Laszlo, who was also presenting. And this is also to bring you to my, I would say, thirdly aspects of my activity, which is related to the curatorial projects. So sometimes, from time to time, I'm also a curator. And because I'm mixing the media, I'm interested in this multiple aspects of the media. Speaking about textiles, one of the exhibitions I created was Haptosonics, where I was looking the way, for example, textiles and sound was normally used as a sound insulator until recently, and the beginning of the 20th century. But because you can integrate electronic elements into textiles, you might actually make them sound and make them musical instruments. So it was an exhibition who was investigating precisely those transformation of textiles into musical instruments from being previously a kind of textile sound insulators. And this also has to do with touch capacitance and the way you touch the textiles to make them sound. Was an exhibition was presented in Oslo in 2013 and later on circulated a little bit. Another project, 2017-18, was trying to look to this kind of technical failures and what we can learn from them, because we all the time have this kind of innovation discourses nowadays which try to put under the carpet what haven't been what doesn't work or all these kind of aspects. And it was a call for, I asked the artists to send their failed projects and to tell the story of their failures. Was that a technical failure? Was that an institutional failure? Was that a user failure? Or in which way do they fail in their projects? And make a collection of how we fail technically or not, or in which way we fail, because this tells us a lot about the projects, I would say, in themselves as well. So it was an exhibition with this kind of electronic textiles failures. And the last project I was also intending to bring here into discussion, it was quite a recent project, Utopian Cities, Program Societies, where, again, with Ioana Macratoma, but also with Dana Diminescu, who she teaches at Institut Polytechnique in Paris, we investigated a bit all these kind of aspects of trying to technologize a society where the technology, like in socialist countries, has such a positive image. And it has been implemented, was also this idea of a rapid industrialization of the country, which was coming together with this way of controlling how the production is put in place and everything else. So it was this kind of attempt to try to take a look the way technology, ideology are working together and try to model a society. And again, it's a way to take a look also to the failures and see exactly where the failures were. And there was a summer camp, and there were some artist residencies which resulted in exhibitions, and that's a website actually where you can see a little bit what happened. So I'm interested in this kind of technological aspects and multiple social implications of the technology, I would say, somewhere at the limit between design practice and science and technology science, more or less. And cybernetic interest. Thank you.